In this video, we're going to add some materiality to our baseboard and to our wall surface in our gallery scene. I am going to select my window trim, my block under the window, and my other window trim, and make sure we select the other side as well. So these are all surfaces that I want to have a somewhat satiny finish, not a glossy finish, but a somewhat satiny finish. I'm thinking they're painted trim. Let's call this surface of type generic painted trim. It is going to not be pure white. It's going to be a little bit on the gray side. And under reflection, it is going to have reflection with a glossiness not of 1. That is going to be too sharp, but of 0.85 with the Fresnel on. That's going to give it a bit of a defocused highlight. So let's assign apply to selection. And let me render. Oops. Let me turn on all my layers and render. There we go. And in order to expedite this rendering process, I'm going to turn on my render region and drag a region just around that area to render. And with my render region, when I click render, it only develops the area within that region. So it allows me to develop it at a higher fidelity without having to wait as long for a render to finish. And I can see here is my highlight. This is the shininess that I'm getting from the reflection that I added, and I can see some reflectivity here. I think I went a little too far with the amount of reflection, so I'm going to go back to my materials, to my reflection layer. I'm going to lower the reflection color. White is pure reflection, black is no reflection, so I'm going to bring it down maybe one third of the way back. And let's render again. Even when the render resolution or the render noise is quite pronounced at the beginning of the render, I can often gauge whether I'm achieving the right amount of reflection or tone that I'm looking for in a rendering. And I'm pleased now with where this is going. One thing I'm not so keen on, I think I'm going to have to do an even tighter render region. Say something small like that. My corners on my profile feel very sharp. Apart from this half-rounded shape, the edges here, these corners are all at 90 degrees, and that is a little too sharp for me. So let's look at a way in VRay, in materiality, that I can change that and soften that edge. I'm going to use a bump map, which creates the illusion of bumpiness. And I'm going to use a texture for that bump map. Going to use a curvature texture. Yes. There we go. And let's go back to our trim, and I'm going to lower this amount to maybe let's try 0.5. And I'm going to go into that map and say I want my radius to be much smaller. I think 0.125, maybe 1/8 of an inch. And let's set this up to 1.0. And in my render settings, I'm going to actually bump this up quite a bit higher to try to see what I'm getting. And So as this resolves, if we look at these corners here that were sharp, we should start to see a sense of them being rounded. In fact, it looks more like they are becoming pronounced rather than rounded. I'm trying to get this material to soften some of my edges, and I think instead of softening it, it is accentuating them. Going back to this curvature, spread. Let's do convex. There, I think that's more what I'm looking for. So it's less pronounced and it can help create the illusion of some softer edges here. Let's move on to our materiality on our wall surface. I'm going to make a material of type generic and call this painted wall. And apply that. And let's make our wall going to make it just slightly robin's egg tone, just a tiny, tiny little bit of robin eggs tone. And under reflection, a little bit of reflection, but very defocused so that we hardly notice it. And let's go back to our render settings. Let's set this back to a more reasonable resolution, something I can render in a small amount of time. And I'm going to turn off my render region. Let's render the entire scene. I'm beginning to feel that the amount of light that's coming into this scene is making it is not exposing enough the camera. That I want it to be brighter essentially, but I'm not going to do that through changing the lighting. What I'm going to do instead is make the camera a little more sensitive to light in the scene, and that way the light that's up here in my shaded part of the model will become a little bit brighter and kind of pick up a little more tone in my model. And I'm going to do that through my camera settings. I'm going to change my exposure value and lower that number. And as I lower that number, it's going to increase the amount of exposure in the scene. And it arguably overexposes this patch of daylighting here, but it does allow me to grab more light into the rest of my scene. And as this resolves, as this becomes less noisy, we'll begin to see some very subtle sense of reflection and highlight in our surfaces, in our wall surface that is very defocused, but takes the brightness coming in from the window here and is going to capture it in the form of reflection on that wall surface. I'm going to render it and pause the video while I let that render run, and then I'll pop back in with it. So this render has been running for a little while now. Let's take a look at it in the frame buffer. As I zoom in, I can begin to see the satin finish on the baseboard, the slightly darker than white gray material, on the wall, the slight robin eggs color, very, very subtle, the bright light coming in from the sun being reflected around the scene in VRay. And while there was a reflection, or is a reflection on this wall material, it is so soft and defocused that I am not seeing any particular figuration of this bright area outside being reflected here, but it is giving it some very subtle life based on where the light is elsewhere in the scene. That's something that I may want to turn off in the future if I need to render in a short period of time, because a soft reflection like this is going to increase my render time significantly. But you can begin to see here how these materials are developing our gallery scene beyond the initial white box modeling setup.